Today, we're going to explore the topic of the issues with games media.
Game of the Year award goes to The Last of Us Part 2.
Okay, I know what you guys are saying. It's rigged. Naughty Dog clearly paid off critics to vote for the game. In recent years, we've seen multiple claims about developers and movie studios supposedly paying off critics for good reviews. The most notable example of this is the case of Batman v Superman. You can tell these reviewers are paid off by Marvel when the same people who praised Age of Ultron are now trash-talking Batman v Superman. Read a lot of reviews saying Batman v Superman sucked, but honestly, I believe that Marvel has paid off a bunch of critics. The critics are trying to kill Batman v Superman. Marvel paid them off. # conspiracy theory. So let's state the obvious here. There is literally no evidence to any of these claims. In its current form, this is pure conspiratorialism. There is not some overt exchange of money happening here. However, behind this conspiracy theory just so happens to be a little bit of truth. The truth is that games media and game critics are biased like many people think they are, but in a bit more of a nuanced and subtle way than what these tweets describe. And that nuance is important. It's the difference between a valid critique of how the system works and just pure tinfoil hat conspiracism. And you know, it would be helpful if someone, say, wrote a book to help us understand all of this. You know, that would just be so useful and so convenient. Manufacturing Consent is the name of a 1988 book written by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky. In it, it details a number of institutional factors that cause the mass media to be biased in the favor of specific interests. More specifically, in the interests of large multinational corporations. This framework, known as the propaganda model, is outlined in the first chapter of the book. And despite its name, it isn't to say that the media is manufacturing any type of overt falsehoods to deceive us, but rather that the way that stories are written favors those specific interests. These structural factors that dominate media operations are not all-controlling and do not always produce simple, homogeneous results. It is well recognized and may even be said to constitute a part of an institutional critique such as we present in this volume, that the various parts of media organizations have some limited autonomy, that individual and professional values influence media work, that policy is imperfectly enforced, and that media policy itself may allow some measure of dissent and reporting that calls into question the accepted viewpoint. These considerations all work to assure some dissent and coverage of inconvenient facts. The beauty of the system, however, is that such dissent and inconvenient information are kept within bounds and at margins, so that while their presence shows that the system is not monolithic, they are not large enough to interfere unduly with the domination of the official agenda. And so because of this, it's still possible for negative press coverage, for example, bad reviews, to sometimes slip through the cracks. In a sense, you can only butter up a game so much. You can't reasonably try to assert that a buggy, broken mess is somehow a 10 out of 10. Or so I thought. In fact, we see games from big franchises get slammed all the time. See the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon reviews for that. However, sometimes that negative coverage is still compromised. For examples, when we see the score not always lining up with the contents of the review. Moving back to Herman and Chomsky's model, they claim that the media operates off of what they call filters, of which there are 5. The first of these filters is the size, ownership, and profit orientation of the mass media. This focuses on how many publications are run by private corporations, many of which are part of even larger megacorporations whose focus is solely on one thing: profit. Many of the large media corporations are fully integrated into the market, and for the others too, pressures of stockholders, directors, and bankers to focus on the bottom line are powerful. To put to numbers the extent to which media is integrated, currently 6 corporations control 90% of American media. To pull an example from the games industry, IGN is controlled by a company called J2 Global at the top level, which is a tech company. And while the writers at IGN don't generally interact directly with their parent company, that company still has some control over the operations there by who they decide to put into leadership positions. If the managers fail to pursue actions that favor shareholder returns, institutional investors will be inclined to sell the stock, depressing its price, or to listen sympathetically to outsiders contemplating takeovers. What this basically means is that if a publication is unable to consistently turn a profit, there is a way to control and perhaps influence them to change what they cover. All of this essentially being a fancy way to say that quality doesn't necessarily matter at these publications so long as they drive clicks. Serious journalism is considered secondary to the profit motive. Of course, this all ties pretty closely into our second filter, the advertising license to do business. So it's a truth in journalism that most publications are unable to stay solvent on their own. Even traditional newspapers like the New York Times and Washington Post that have paywalls still run ads on their sites and in their print papers. And for sites that don't have a paywall, ads are really their only source of income, which is the way that most games media operates because most gamers generally don't like having their media behind a paywall and would never think of paying for news. And because of this model, to an extent, you're not the real customer of these publications. In fact, you're the product. The advertisers are the real customers to these places. And because of that, the messaging that is sent out through these publications is partly influenced by those advertisers. As Grant Tinker, the head of NBC TV, observed, television is an advertising-supported medium, and to the extent that support falls out, programming will change. And even though this quote talks about television, it still rings true for print media as well. Companies will change their content if they are not satisfied with the ad revenue that they draw. What this model may also do is cause more serious journalism to be pushed to the wayside because of the way that it might influence the buying habits of the readers. Advertisers will want more generally to avoid programs with serious complexities and disturbing controversies that interfere with the buying mood. They seek programs that will lightly entertain and thus fit in with the spirit of the primary purpose of program purchases, the dissemination of a selling message. We still obviously get many critical works in the games industry, but they are generally much rarer than the more traditional enthusiast media content that we get that is meant to drive hype and potentially get you to buy games. This has become even more of a problem in recent years as the business side and journalism side of news agencies has become more and more intertwined through things like native advertising, where companies literally sponsor stories. This allows advertising companies to have even more control over the stories that are written. We've also seen a pretty increasingly disturbing trend of studios paying influencers to promote their games under the guise of serious game reviews, which I hope you don't need to have explained to you why that's a problem. And on that note, why don't we move on to our third filter, sourcing mass media news. And this is where I get to share a little bit of my personal experience as a former student journalist. In journalism, access to primary sources is everything. This is largely to maintain the appearance of impartiality in our writing. This, however, can sometimes become a problem when official sources are taken at their word and cited completely uncritically. The reason this is done is largely a matter of economics, tying back to our previous two filters. Taking information from sources that may be presumed credible reduces investigative expense, whereas material from sources that are not prima facie credible, or that will elicit criticism and threats, requires careful checking and costly research. How this applies to the games industry largely has to do with access to review copies. In our modern internet marketplace, getting out a review first is important, and in order to do that, critics need to be able to get games ahead of time. But being able to obtain games ahead of time like that requires you to have a good relationship with publishers. In 2012, Forbes magazine ran an article where they discussed how in the games industry, quote, access is precious. The author of the article questions the potential conflict of interest of the relationship between journalists and publishers. He questioned how many of the benefits that journalists get from these relationships might negatively impact the impartiality of their work. I have no idea, beyond rumor and speculation, the extent to which access is given or withheld based on critics' reviews of games. Will a bad review or a more critical site overall find itself left out in the cold when it comes time for the next big launch? Will access to interviews or sources be limited to sites that write critically of a studio or its games? Even if none of this actually occurs, certainly the worry that access might be cut off must worry many sites and reviewers. In a sense, access and relationships are one and the same. The closer a journalist becomes to their subject, the more personal that relationship becomes. With better relationships comes better access. The impulse to not betray people by offering up a bad review must be very strong. Add to this other perks like invites to parties, review copies of games, etc., and you start to see how a problem surfaces unintentionally. To talk on the author's concerns about access being cut off, there have been a few isolated incidents where this has happened. One such time was in 2017, when Dead Effect 2 developer Badfly got busted for doing just this. Similarly, 1 year prior to that, Square Enix allegedly did this to a Spanish review site for giving Final Fantasy XV a 7.5 out of 10. God. 7.5 out of 10. What has happened to games journalism where 7.5 out of 10 is considered a bad review and you're willing to cut people off for that? Just seriously. There are also other cases that involve being blacklisted for breaking review embargoes. One such occasion happened last year when a reviewer was blacklisted for leaking images of unrevealed Pokemon in Pokemon Sword and Shield. In this case, you can see why Nintendo might want to blacklist someone, as that can ruin the surprise that they're trying to curate. Of course, embargoes, if they go too far, can be detrimental, and I think you know which example I'm going to cite. The review embargo that Naughty Dog had for The Last of Us Part 2 was probably one of the most restrictive embargoes known to the games industry, and it restricted critics to talking about only 3 sections of the game. The publication Screen Rant explained the issue saying, "Nearly every reviewer from a major publication mentioned these restrictions, and they led to difficulties communicating reviewers' feelings about the game. Polygon's review, for example, touched on similar points about The Last of Us 2's controversial violence again and again in different phrasings and contexts, attempting to get across how relentlessly brutal the game is without being allowed to actually discuss anything that could truly illustrate it. Some positive reviewers, meanwhile, made stumbling exaggerations, such as podcast host Jeff Kanata's infamous comparison of The Last of Us Part 2 to Schindler's List. Ultimately, since publishers set the conditions for review copies and what you can't say prior to launch, they have all of the cards, and thus the quality of coverage can be compromised by restrictive embargoes such as theirs. If you set the conditions in such a way that does not allow you to talk about the controversial stuff in the media, it becomes harder to do your job. And all of this talk of access and being blacklisted ties directly into our fourth filter, FLAC and the enforcers. This is the mechanism that is used to keep those that stray from the propaganda model in line. In its most basic form, it is a negative response to media coverage, and it can come from a variety of sources. And can you guess which sources publications are probably more likely to listen to? Because of the harm that FLAC can cause on your brand and by extension sales, publications will usually try to preempt FLAC in order to avoid the negative repercussions of a backlash. If FLAC is produced on a large scale or by individual or groups with substantial resources, it can be both uncomfortable and costly to the media. If certain kinds of fact, position, or program are thought likely to elicit FLAC, this prospect can be a deterrent. FLAC can originate from all sorts of sources. We've seen in some cases it originates directly from the corporations that don't like the coverage. An example of this would be BioWare's response to Jason Schreier's criticism of their crunch practices in their work on Anthem and Mass Effect Andromeda, to which they wrote, "People in this industry put so much passion and energy into making something fun. We don't see the value in tearing down one another or another's work." This quote was obviously of fairly limited efficacy because no one likes EA. I think that's just a fact that if you are a gamer, you probably don't like EA. Even if you enjoy some of the few good games they've had, you probably still dislike them generally as a company. What is more effective, however, is if the FLAC originates from the masses, that is, the consumers who go to these sites and generate ad revenue. For comparison, we're going to look at the same journalist's work, Jason Schreier's, but over his reporting on the crunch practices for Cyberpunk 2077. This was, prior to launch, one of the most hyped games of the year, and since launch, it's had a few controversies to say the least. The main thing to note here is that in response to one of the most hyped games of the year, there was reporting saying that it might be unethically made a lot of people uncomfortable. And that discomfort worked in the favor of CD Projekt Red. Why do you as a company need to say anything if you have an army of fans willing to defend you from your detractors. This ties into something that I talked about in my Pokemon Sword and Shield video about tying brands to your identity. Ultimately, brand loyalty benefits the corporations that you're loyal to. But with all of this talk of flack, we've seen people like Jason Schreier still have trekked on with their work regardless of the backlash. And that ties back to the thing I said at the beginning, how the media isn't a monolith. You are able to get away with coverage that might elicit flack if you're careful with it. In a lecture given in 1989, Noam Chomsky had this to say on the subject. In fact, some of the top investigative reporters in the country are very conscious of the way the system works and play it like a violin, just looking for moments when they can sneak stories through. Some of the best known of them are even far more cynical about the media than I am, actually, but they just find ways to work within the system, and often they get out material that's very important. An example that might be reporting on crunch practices after a game is launched and has had a negative backlash against it for its poor quality. With all of that talk of flack out of the way, let's move on to the last filter, shall we? This one's a bit weird compared to the others. It's usually the odd one out in the propaganda model. It's called anti-communism as a control mechanism. For context, if you didn't already gather this from the year, the book was written during the height of the Cold War. And thus, fear of the Soviet bloc and communism and the potential for nuclear war was at an all-time high. Even with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Chomsky has still stood by this filter, however amending it claiming, quote, "The war on terror has provided a useful substitute for the Soviet menace." Some sources have generalized this to being just about the presence of some type of common enemy to have you rail against. The true beauty of this, however, is that you don't actually have to be ideologically aligned with this common enemy. This ideology helps mobilize the populace against an enemy, and because the concept is fuzzy, it can be used against anybody advocating policies that threaten property interests or support accommodation with communist states and radicalism. Liberals at home, often accused of being pro-communist or insufficiently anti-communist, are kept continuously on the defensive in a cultural milieu in which anti-communism is the dominant religion. If they allow communism, or something that can be labeled as communism, to triumph in the provinces while they are in office, the political costs are heavy. In effect, this filter ties to the general in-group, out-group mentality that a lot of people have. In normal times, as well as in periods of red scares, issues tend to be framed in terms of a dichotomized world of communist and anti-communist powers, with gains and losses allocated in contesting sides, and rooting for our side considered an entirely legitimate news practice. Obviously, based on everything I've said, you can tell that this largely applies to coverage of political events. However, it can still be applied to coverage of media as well, even if most of them are produced by forces that exist within capitalism. It may prompt game journalists to perhaps have their coverage downplay, or not even discuss at all, institutional problems that may lead to things like loot boxes and crunch practices in the first place. Even when you have articles that correctly point out that issues in the games industry sometimes are a result of the capitalist system, like say Jeff Grubb's coverage of Super Mario 3D All-Stars for VentureBeat, they often don't offer any solutions or alternatives to the issue, but rather they politely ask the company to do better in the future, even though it doesn't have to. Although granted, I still do appreciate this article's mix of snark and cynicism about the issue. And that's the propaganda model. And I want to reiterate, as I've mentioned, the media is not a monolith. I just want to make sure that you get that clear. There are cracks in the system, and critical journalism does often peek through them. And I also want to make a point that despite the names manufacturing consent and propaganda model, just because media acts like propaganda doesn't necessarily mean it's effective in doing that job. In fact, we've seen the majority of Americans already distrust the mainstream media, so I think we have an argument to say that it's currently not working as propaganda. The ultimate point of this video is to sort of help people understand why the media can be so bad at times, using the language of an industry that is so notably bad all the time. It helps us to put into more academic terms what a lot of us have kind of already suspected about the media. So the next time you see a major AAA game get glowing review scores despite bugs, and an indie game getting slammed a lot harder for the same types of bugs, you know why. However, thankfully, the internet has made it a lot easier to gain access to alternative sources of news. Of course, this can also be detrimental, as it allows a lot of dangerous misinformation to be spread around.
I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
On the flip side, though, it allows you to get a lot of new perspectives that you wouldn't hear through the mainstream media and round out your view of the world. And of course, sites like YouTube have tried to fight this by changing the algorithms to punish independent creators in favor of legacy media. And you could do the whole propaganda model analysis on YouTube and their actions, and you would find out why they're doing what they're doing. And all of this action by big tech to drown out independent creators is why it's extremely important to pay attention to the antitrust lawsuit against Facebook brought on by the Federal Trade Commission. This could be huge. If this goes through, there could be a wave of tech breakups that weaken Google and Facebook's control over the flow of information online. Ultimately, the intertwining of news and big business has been a major issue, more or less since the invention of the printing press. And as far as I'm concerned, it's about time something happens to help us democratize news that much further.